Welcome to another edition of the Giants Huddle podcast, brought to you by Citizens, the official bank of the Giants. Coming to you from the Hackensack Meridian Hill podcast studio. Keep getting better. The Giants have a new head coach. John Harbaugh will be the Giants' next head coach in 2026 and moving forward. And no one has been more on top of this story. His official title is columnist for The Athletic, but now I think it has to be NFL insider, reporter, sleuth. That's a longtime New York-based sports reporter, Ian O'Connor. Ian, good to see you, my friend, and this has been a heck of a week for you, buddy.
John, thanks. Great to be with you. Thanks for that introduction. Yeah, columnists get a bad rap for not really being reporters, but I was always a reporter before I was a columnist.
I know you were.
Tried not to forget that, so it applied here, but that is obviously a great situation here for the New York Giants to hire. At the time of the hiring, I think he's the most accomplished person to ever get this job. The Giants, as you know, have never hired a Super Bowl winning coach. And so this is a monumental moment for the franchise.
Yeah, I think it's funny. I wrote the same thing for the website, and I think Dan Reeves is probably the second closest, right, having made it to 3 Super Bowls, but no one else had ever won one. So I'm with you. And look, this might sound like the simplest question with the easiest answer, but maybe you have something a little bit more. Why was John Harbaugh such an obvious target for the Giants to go all in on the way they did?
I say, John, I think the Giants would have felt the same way about Mike Tomlin, except Tomlin was not going to make himself available to coach in 2026. And I think the Giants did more homework on Harbaugh because they had maybe some intel on that. But if it was just a guess that Harbaugh would be the most likely AFC North Titan to be available, they were right. And so they did work on John before he was fired. And John was aware that it was possible he'd be let go. I know when he walked into the building in Baltimore that day, he thought he would be retained for a 19th season. Obviously, he wasn't. But before that day, he had looked at some of the possible openings out there around the league, and he had the Giants at the top of his list even before Joe Schoen made that first phone call. So the Giants had Harbaugh at the top of their list. John had the Giants at the top of his list. So it was a good marriage from the start. It looked like a perfect match. And obviously, we'll see how it plays out going forward.
Yeah, and so let's go here. You talked about, and I'll use the quote, full court press that the Giants put on to get Harbaugh. And you talked about how they've kind of done work on him before he was even let go. You wrote about this extensively, Ian. Take us through the process of how the Giants attack this with every part of their organization from ownership down to try to land John Harbaugh.
Obviously, John, I can't really speak to what the Titans and the Falcons and other organizations were doing because I don't really cover them on a regular basis. The Giants, as a columnist, I've been around the organization for a long time, and I think they did more work on this one than any search for any candidate I've ever seen. And again, it started before Harbaugh was fired. And I think that's important because as soon as he was fired, the Giants pounced. Joe Schoen was making calls, repeated calls to Brian Harlan, John's agent. I want to say in the first couple hours, Schoen must have called him 3 times. And it was go time right away. And I think that made an impression. I know it made an impression on Harbaugh and his camp. And they made it clear that they wanted him more than anybody else by a lot. And I did talk to Harbaugh after he was fired, and he wanted the Giants. It was clear in my phone call. In fact, when I was talking to him, and this was 2 days after he was fired, he said, I think we can win some games next year. He wasn't looking to rebuild with the Giants in 2026. He had looked at the roster. He liked Dart a lot. And he said, I think with the players coming back from injuries, we can win games next year. I'm not looking to rebuild. And he said, I never making a note of that, which I noted in a column in The Athletic. And so, yeah, the whole idea of being the head coach, and he called them the New York Football Giants. He got it. He pictured himself in that jacket, in that cap, leading that team out of the tunnel. It was very appealing to him. The history of the franchise, the historical standing that the New York Giants have in the history of the National Football League, all of that stuff he got. And let me say this, 4 years ago, I was talking to him when the job was last open. And I said, do you think your brother would have interest in that job, Jim? And he said, the New York Football Giants? Are you kidding me? He was like, who wouldn't have interest in being the head coach of the Giants. So he got it. He understands what the Giants mean to the NFL and what the Giants mean to New York.
And I think the other part of this too, when you go through the reasons why John Harbaugh wanted the Giants, a lot of it had to do, I think, with the respect that people in NFL circles have for Giants ownership and kind of how they went about this. Can you just take us through that a little bit, here, Ian, and how Giants ownership played a role in getting this done and why they made it appealing for John Harbaugh?
I'm not sure that Harbaugh had much contact with Steve Tisch, but through the competition committee, John Mara's role there, I think Harbaugh had dealt with John Mara a number of times on issues in the league and really came away impressed with how he carried himself. And as we all know, John Mara is as respected a figure in the NFL as anyone. And he is someone who, in a situation like this, where you're looking at a top candidate for a head coach opening, is a big asset for the Giants because of the respect that John Mara has around the league and around sports in general. So that really was a positive factor here in favor of getting this deal done. It was Harbaugh it didn't have to be explained to him what John Mara meant to the league and how he was viewed, because that's the way Harbaugh saw him. And that was something that was a real asset for the Giants in getting this deal done.
And then Ian, you reported this. It was exclusive to you, I believe. That Chris, John's younger brother, John, obviously dealing with some health issues right now. We're all praying for his recovery and for him to get better. But Chris had to kind of step in and do a little bit extra with this, correct? And I think Giant fans, and I'm sure you see it on social media and you hear from Giant fans, they have a certain impression of Chris Mara. But I think people don't realize that in league circles, he's viewed a little bit differently than maybe fans view him.
Yeah, I always respected the fact that Chris went outside the organization to run his own scouting service years ago, to be a GM of the New Jersey Arena League team, the Gladiators. And then when he came back, he didn't get the GM job that went to Jerry Reese. And so he's been in the background to some degree over the last number of years, but now he's back in the spotlight because of the pursuit of Harbaugh and how he did go to his home Sunday before everything got started, really. And that first visit that Harbaugh had with a team official of that magnitude with any of the organizations that were interested in him, that really made a difference. Chris Mara's he laid out a plan of how the organization was really going to support John as the head coach. And it was a really good meeting. They had lunch. And I've been at Harbaugh's house. It's a very nice house, sort of off a country road in suburban Baltimore. And I think that was a difference maker in this process in a very big way for the New York Giants.
Huddle up, get in here. If you're lined up here, you gotta go over the middle with it to score.
Right. How do we make that happen?
I don't know.
But Citizens does.
Make sense of your money with Citizens, official bank of Eli Manning.
What was that pitch, Ian? I'm not sure how many details you have in terms of what that organizational support would look like and why that pledge and what was involved in it made the job so appealing for John Harbaugh.
And that the Giants would give him the resources he needed to win and personnel influence, which he had earned through his 18 years of winning in Baltimore, that would be there and not be an issue. And that certainly his salary concerns, he didn't have any salary concerns, but if he did, the Giants would take care of those. Infrastructure, just organizational support, the collaborative nature of the building, I think was a selling point that Chris put forth. And just a pleasant day. And it was informal, but that really was a factor here because no organization had somebody from ownership or management in John Harbaugh's house at that point. And it just started things off in a very, very positive direction for the Giants. I'm not saying that John Harbaugh isn't the coach of the New York Giants and that meeting doesn't happen, but the Giants, it just showed you, John, how much out in front of everybody else the Giants were, because the Falcons didn't have somebody in Harbaugh's house. The Titans didn't, the Dolphins didn't, and the Browns didn't. The Giants did, and they ended up with the head coach.
You mentioned the collaborative nature of the organization, how that was appealing to John Harbaugh. And you mentioned how Joe Schoen, very early in this process, was on the phone with Harbaugh's agent, trying to get it to him as soon as he was let go. He had conversations with Harbaugh directly. What was it about Joe Schoen, his approach, and the way he works with people that made him appealing as someone that John Harbaugh would want to work with going forward? And what other role did Joe Shane play in trying to get this done?
Well, I know after his very first conversation with Joe Shane, Harbaugh told me he liked him and felt he could work with him. And I don't think he knew him or knew a whole lot about him. And obviously the record is what it is the last 3 years. So there are questions about that. But I know that Harbaugh looked at the roster and some of the pieces that Shane had acquired and liked them and liked those pieces and thought he could win games. And I just think getting to know Joe Shane and the fact that Joe was on the Steve Tisch private jet that went down to Baltimore to pick up John Harbaugh and just to spend another hour and a half with him, 2 hours, even though Harbaugh was going to be 9 hours with the Giants later that day, that showed something to the coach. And so I just think it was getting to know each other. And I'm sure that Joe Shane also assured John that, hey, don't worry, we're going to work together. You're going to have some influence over the roster. You've earned that. And listen, the Giants, whatever they're paying John Harbaugh, let's say it's in the neighborhood of $20 million, that's what I believe it to be. It wouldn't make any sense to bring Harbaugh into this organization after 18 years of winning 180 regular season games, 13 playoff victories, 8 on the road, which is an NFL record, and say you have no say over who's going to be on your team. So I think, and listen, John Harbaugh has had good partnerships with his GMs. Ozzie Newsome, one of the best to ever do it. Eric DaCosta, one of the best in the league. He likes being a part of partnerships that produce winning teams, and I think he sees the potential for that with Joe Shane.
Yeah, you had a specific question, right? Where if John Harbaugh wants to draft one player at 5 and Joe Shane maybe prefers another, they had enough conversations with ownership, Joe Shane, and the whole management group that, look, if that happens, we have enough of a collaborative process where this will be worked out and everyone's going to be happy.
We saw it in play, as you know, John, with the Jaxson Dart drafting. And it appeared that Brian Daboll was more in favor of it than Joe Shane. And Joe Shane has taken some hits for that. And I don't know how you look at it, but I've been covering sports in this market for 40 years. I always, if the GM makes the move and acquires the player, I don't care who liked him more or who didn't. You made the move. He's your player. Now, you get the credit if it works out, and you get the blame if it doesn't. So far, Jaxson Dart looks like a guy who's going to work out in a pretty big way. So let's assume that Brian Daboll wanted him more than Joe Shane did. But Joe listened to his head coach and said, okay, you want that player. He's your quarterback. Let's go get him. And he made the move to trade up to get Jaxson Dart. To me, that's a positive for Joe Shane. That's not a negative. And if you're John Harbaugh, and I know he looked at it, he's like, okay, here was a situation where it looked like Daboll wanted Dart more than Shane did. But guess what? Joe Shane listened to his head coach, and he made the move, and it worked out. So if he's going to listen to Brian Daboll, chances are he's certainly going to listen to John Harbaugh.
Yeah, by the way, I'm with you. The idea that a GM would pick his quarterback of the future and it's a player that he didn't like and trade up in the first round for that player was always just ridiculous to me. Like that's not how the NFL works. So I'm absolutely with you on that. You mentioned Jaxson Dart, so why don't we go there next? What makes him, from your conversations with John, appealing as a guy that can be his quarterback, which obviously is maybe the most important position in all sports?
Well, Harbaugh is certainly used to having, in recent years, a dual threat quarterback who's very good. And Lamar Jackson arguably became the best quarterback in the league as a 2-time league MVP with some postseason disappointments. So it's interesting because John Harbaugh, though he doesn't have a quarterback's background, he's won a Super Bowl with a pure pocket passer in Joe Flacco. And then he developed a dual threat quarterback into arguably the best player in the league. And so he's had experience with all kinds of quarterbacks, different styles, but I think his recent experience with Jackson will help him with Dart, a guy who can beat you with his legs and his arm. Of course, you got to figure out, okay, when do we use those legs, and we need to protect you so you can play 17 games, and that's something that John, with his experience in the league, I think will be able to get done with Jaxson Dart, but liked his confidence, the way he carries himself, obviously. Really, all the tools are there. You look at, and how did this guy fall to, 25 in the draft? And, hey, Aaron Rodgers fell to 24 and he became a first ballot Hall of Famer. It doesn't really matter where you're drafted. Tom Brady, 199th in the draft, the greatest to ever do it. So I think, I know he looked at the video. I don't know. One thing I don't know, John, maybe this is a question I'll ask him at some point. Did he like Dart better than Cam Ward when he looked at both on tape? I know he liked both of them. I'm not sure if he gave Dart the edge, maybe Ward the edge, and just liked the Giants' job better. But that's a question that needs to be asked at some point. But he definitely thought he could win a lot of games with Jaxson Dart going forward, and that was a big part of why he decided to take this job.
And that was another part of your story that, this isn't a deal, and you mentioned it earlier in the interview, where he thinks this is a 2 or 3 year project. Ian, with this roster, he seems to think that they can win games this year. Maybe we're not talking Super Bowl or anything like that, but this can be a good competitive team that's competing for a playoff spot this year.
And that's the way he looked at it. Again, Neighbors coming back, Scatterboo coming back. I already have a left tackle. I've got some running backs, some playmakers. I got a quarterback who looks like he's going to be a really good player in this league. I've got pass rushers. So obviously, the Giants have some holes, and he recognized that looking at the film of a 4-13 team. You're going to see some things that need to be fixed. But he had a long-time scout he trusts look at the Giants' tape, look at their roster, the cap situation, and got some positive reviews from that person. And John himself liked what he saw. And he told me at one point after looking at the tape, I said, "Hey, is there anything that's concerning you?" He said, "Well, yeah, obviously there's some things, but," he said, I can work on those things, but there is a lot to be excited about." Those were his exact words after looking at tape, some tape anyway, of the 2025 Giants. So he certainly liked it enough, thought it had enough potential to take this job, believing that 2026 is not really a rebuilding year.
A few more coming here for Ian O'Connor, excellent columnist for The Athletic. No one's covered the Giants hiring of John Harbaugh better than him. Giants Huddle podcast brought to you by Citizens, the official bank of the Giants. From game day celebrations to your everyday financial needs, Big Blue fans get the most out of every moment with Citizens. Learn more at citizensbank.com/Giants. All right, Ian, you talked about him getting good feedback from a scout. It seems like he's gotten a lot of good feedback from a lot of different people about the Giants. And whenever you do want to take one of these jobs, you're going to talk to a lot of people around the league, Ian. And you had some of this reporting, other people had some of it, that he had a conversation with Eli Manning, that he reached out to Eli through Peyton. I think Gary Myers had that one, if I recall correctly. He talked to Tom Coughlin. He even had a conversation with Brian Dable. And Ian, this might be the first time ever that I've heard of a coach that was fired within the previously 2 months by an organization, get on a call with the guy that's going to take his job and be like, "No, you should take this job. It's a great organization. It's an awesome place to work." I'm not sure I've ever heard of that before.
Me neither. And yeah, I think you're right, John. And listen, Dable's also, he wants to be a head coach again. So I think he's showing, hey, I'm a reasonable person. I know what the record was. I want owners to realize I'm a team player. And if I can help, I'm going to help. And I think it's a good idea to do it. So I think he gave a very strong scouting report on Dart and on John Mara and Steve Tisch. What he said about Joe Schoen, I don't know, to be honest with you. Obviously, Joe Schoen fired him. So, and really, actually, John Mara and Steve Tisch fired him. So, and he gave a positive review on those gentlemen. So what he said about Joe Schoen, I don't know. But Harbaugh also understands that the context there needs to be applied. And so John did his research on everyone, on the owners, on Joe Schoen, on the players, on assistant coaches, and he really talked to a lot of people. It wasn't just some of the names we heard like Eli Manning. He was talking to a lot of people around the league about everybody he was going to work with. But in his heart, from day one, when he got fired, and listen, I was doing a funny thing on X where I was putting a golf leaderboard up pretty much every other day, right? The John Harbaugh Invitational. I had the Giants in the lead every day, but I had the Falcons and Titans like a shot behind. Honestly, I felt like the Giants had a 5-shot lead the whole time because in talking to him, texting, it never felt like anybody else had a real chance. I hate to say that because I don't want to tick off Falcons fans and Titans fans, but I think he just wanted to be the head coach of the New York Giants.
I mentioned the conversation with Tom Coughlin. Should Giant fans view this, Ian, the same way they viewed the Giants bringing in Coughlin to kind of settle the organization and just create an identity for the building and the team, the same way Coughlin did when he came in to replace Jim Fossil in 2004?
Yeah, I think listen, Darius Slayton said it. We need a Coughlin-esque person to come in here and be this head coach and instill some discipline and accountability. And I would say the Giants need Harbaugh even more than they needed Coughlin because back then the Giants had gone to the Super Bowl, what, 4 years before that?
No, you're right.
So the drought here, 14 years really, and a lot of losing in those 14 years, a couple of winning seasons, but it's been a long time. And so I think this is, again, doing this for 4 decades, I cannot remember a bigger hire for the New York Giants than this one. I actually think this is bigger than Coughlin and more important. And frankly, Harbaugh's record is better than Coughlin's was in terms of winning percentage and having a Super Bowl. Coughlin did a great job in Jacksonville, but John's record is better. And so it's certainly arguable that he is the best coach at the time of the hiring that the New York Giants have ever hired.
I think you're uniquely qualified to answer this question. I'm not sure there's another reporter on this planet that has as close of a relationship with the Giants organization and John Harbaugh as you. So I'm going to ask you this: why do you think the person and coach John Harbaugh is and the organization that the Giants are match? Why does it fit? Why do you think this is going to work?
The appreciation for the history of the league and their place in it. John wants to be an historical figure. The Giants are already a major part of the league's history. And I think they just have that feeling and that desire to make more history. And I do think, though he did not say this, but I certainly got the distinct sense that John Harbaugh understood that being the coach of the Giants, the New York Giants, is different. If you win a championship, it's different than winning one with, say, the Arizona Cardinals. It just is. And so the Titans and the Falcons had interesting things about them, but at the end of the day, there's something different about the Giants' job and understanding. If he wins a second ring, first off, he'd be the first guy to ever do that, to win Super Bowls with 2 different franchises. So what does that do for your legacy? And also, when you do it in New York, we all know Mark Messier won 5 Stanley Cups in Edmonton. The one everyone talks about is the one he won at New York in 1994. So Harbaugh has an understanding of all of that. And the Giants needed a CEO leader. They needed a disciplinarian with instant credibility. The moment he walks into that locker room, Abdul Carter and everyone else will respect John Harbaugh. So that is exactly what they needed, and John understood that.
If you want to know how to manage 2 minutes of crunch time football, I'm your man. But if you're wondering about a long-term financial plan, you should talk to Citizens. Hey, I can also talk lawn care.
I'd like to learn about a mowing routine.
Yes, I knew I could help. Make sense of your money with Citizens.
I think was it 2016? You had the great article about the Harbaugh under competition and stuff like that, if I remember correctly. I think
That's right. 10 years ago. So
it was
wow.
Terrific story. So you have a really good feel about everything he's about. For Giant fans that, Ravens are in the AFC, you see him on national TV, but you're not following him every day. What are the tenets, some of the core principles that you're going to see in a John Harbaugh-led team that Giant fans will look forward to?
He's unbelievably competitive. Obviously, the Harbaugh family, that's how they are. When I went to his home 10 years ago, we started out by shooting baskets. He had this nice basketball court, and I was making a lot of shots, and he was missing a lot of shots, and I could tell he was getting angry. And I'm going to start this 3-hour interview with him in a bad mood, so I started intentionally missing some shots, and I told him that later. He claimed I was lying. So anyway, before we started the interview, he needed to win something. So he took me upstairs he had this shuffleboard table with a scoreboard, and he absolutely obliterated me. It was like 98-2, it felt like. And he kept running up the score on the scoreboard. I'm like, Johnny, at some point, you don't need to keep score. You're winning 50-0. So anyway, that just gives you a sense of the way he approaches life and competition. But I think physicality, discipline, attention to detail, and the belief that you can accomplish great things because he beat his brother in a Super Bowl. And so he wants to get back to the mountaintop. There have been seasons where it looked like the Ravens were ready to win that second Super Bowl, and he never got it done. And I think he's really chasing that. He does not want to retire with 1 ring. He does not. And again, to do it with 2 different franchises obviously would make history, and I think he's prepared to do that.
And I think he's a pretty flexible coach. And you just look at how he went from Joe Flacco to Lamar Jackson, right? Could you have more polar opposite quarterbacks than those 2 guys with their skill sets? He's had to go through a bunch of different assistants and coordinators, because when you're a great team, guess what? People are going to poach your coaches, right? I feel like he's a guy that's able to adjust to his players well and bring in a staff that's able to extend his vision, even if maybe their approaches aren't all the same, if you know what I mean.
From the outside looking in, I think people would see Harbaugh as a player's coach to some degree. When he had to establish his culture when he first got the job, he had to take on some really established veterans, Ray Lewis, Ed Reed, Terrell Suggs. Those guys were set in their ways. And I know like Suggs and I believe it was Ray Lewis, they each had 2 lockers in the locker room. And Harbaugh said to them, this isn't going to work. This is a bad optic here. I know how great you guys are, but everybody's going to have 1 locker. And it took a while for Suggs to buy into that later on. I know that was a bit of and also Ed Reed, maybe one of the greats of all time at his position. John and Ed Reed didn't really see eye to eye on some things, but John wouldn't back down, and eventually Reed conformed to what Harbaugh wanted. So he can impose his will on a locker room. And at the same time, we've seen him, there's great video about his conversation on the sideline with Lamar Jackson where he's telling him, do you realize like kids around the country are going to be wearing your jersey? You're changing the game, and I love you. We love you. And so he's really good about putting the kicker who misses the kick in Pittsburgh, and he goes up to him, puts his arm around him. John Harbaugh knows when to put his arm around guys that he sometimes has to rip in practice or even during games. He's very good at that. He coaches with humanity, and I think that's important, particularly with this generational player.
And by the way, for fans that want more context and everything Ian just talked about, you can find this old article. I think it's on ESPN.com, if I remember right, Ian, right? Where, guys, literally, he's boarding up Terrell Suggs' second locker, and Suggs tears the boards down. He puts it back up.
Right.
It's crazy because they were all mad that they hired him instead of Rex Ryan. So he had to, like, basically sell the defense on him. You're not going to have that thing here because there's nobody with that type of history here, Ian. But I think it shows you, and I think that's important for coaches. Like we were here with, following Joe Torre, all the great coaches we've seen here in New York. There are different ways to reach different players, and coaches have to be able to almost individualize their approach to the 70 so guys that are in the locker room once you get to the season. And that's what makes it such a tough job.
Well, I think because he is adaptable and he's basically seen it all in his 18 years as a head coach in Baltimore. And as you said, with the different styles of quarterbacks and everything else, having different coordinators and evolving with the times. And I think that Harbaugh's done a very good job of that. And that's one thing that comes up from people who've asked me about him is they said, he looks a little different from Jim's style now with the Chargers. And then, of course, when he was at Michigan, and that he coaches maybe with more humanity than his brother does. And no knock on Jim Harbaugh, who's obviously a great coach, but I would agree with that. I think he's a little more relatable to the young players. And so it'll be interesting because, as you know, there's so many different personalities in a locker room, but he's really good at that. And I think he's a delegator, so his coordinators are very important. Monken coming in as the offensive coordinator, and assuming that's a done deal, and his defensive coordinator is obviously going to be important because John does delegate, and he's more of a CEO overseer, but he's a damn good one, and the Giants, I believe, are lucky to have him.
And you took me to my final question. The Giants, obviously, with the coordinators, have to go through the Rooney Rule regulations. They got to do a full interview process, all that stuff. We'll see who lands the jobs. And he's had to go through a lot of different coordinators. As I mentioned, Ian, when you're a great coach, your coordinators are going to get plucked, right? They're going to get head coaching jobs elsewhere. He's had to deal with that. But he's done a fantastic job in his time in Baltimore replacing those guys. And a lot of times not even missing a beat, replacing one high-level coach with another. Why do you think he's been so good at finding such good assistant coaches and identifying up-and-comers that will step in and do a good job? And what's important to him when he fills out this coaching staff? The Giants have a lot of assistants that are still in their contract from the previous regime. I'm sure they'll have conversations about those guys. What should we look for as Harbaugh tries to build out this staff, which, as you mentioned, for a CEO head coach, can really make or break your tenure with a team?
He's had success with that, and that's very important. You've seen organizations, including really the Jets, I've seen struggle with assistant coaches and coordinators, and that's really hurt them over the years, and the Giants at times. But I think that there are people around the league who really want to work for John Harbaugh because of some of the things we've said here. And I think that's a factor that will help the Giants. Monken has done it at a high level, so there's experience there. And I just think looking for people, obviously, really every day basically treats every day like it's Game 7 of the World Series. And that's John Harbaugh, and he wants people like that. He usually is successful in recruiting those people, and I suspect he'll do the same thing this time around.
Ian, anything we missed? Anything you think else that Giant fans should know either about this search, about John Harbaugh, and what's coming next for the Giants?
Just think the overall sense that he gets New York, even though he's never worked in New York. He's a guy who grew up in Toledo, Ohio, and Ann Arbor, Michigan, but he really does seem to understand what this franchise means to this city. And of course, what winning a Super Bowl here would mean as opposed to really coaching anywhere else. And so I think he gets it. Now, the proof is in the pudding, right? And we'll find out. But he is looking next year to win games. He's not looking to rebuild. He's 63 years old. He does want to coach probably another 8 to 10 years, but he doesn't want to wait. He wants to, and I do know that he believes he can win games in the NFC East, because I was saying to a number of people in and around his camp that the Atlanta Falcons really give him the best chance to win the division right away, because an 8-19 just won that division. And he's not afraid of the NFC East. I know that for a fact.
A Harbaugh not afraid of competition? Really? Shocked? I know, we're all shocked. And by the way, I didn't even ask Ian, he seems to really handle the media well. Like, it seems to come pretty natural to him, so I don't imagine there's going to be an issues here with him kind of working the New York media.
I think it would be the same level of criticism that he faced or critiquing in Baltimore, just there's more of us. That's all. And he has to get used to that. And listen, nobody likes to be criticized, so I'm sure there are times he's been irritated by some things, particularly since he was winning so many games. But that'll be a little bit of a culture change for him. Just the number of media members who are present every day, covering practice and covering games. And so it is a little different. And I think there will be an adjustment period, but he's a personable guy. And because he does win games, he certainly should be able to handle New York.
Ian, tell the people where they can find all your tremendous work.
At The Athletic, which I think is doing sports journalism right now better than anybody else.
Yeah.
And on X at Ian_O'Connor, no apostrophe necessary.
Ian, you're the best. It's been great following you during this journey to land John Harbaugh as the Giants' next head coach. We really appreciate the time. Thanks so much. And we'll see you at the press conference, my friend.
Look forward to it, John. Thanks.
That's Ian O'Connor on the Giants Huddle podcast, brought to you by Citizens, the official bank of the Giants. I'm John Schmeelk. Thanks for being with us, everybody. We will see you next time.